Welcome back. Let's take you to East Africa, where Kenyans have reacted furiously to the news that 20 lawmakers have traveled to watch the World Cup in Russia at the expense of taxpayers. They're watching 4 games, including the final, in a 2-week trip to Moscow, estimated to gulp hundreds of thousands of US dollars. The lawmakers caught the attention of Kenyans when they posted selfies in a stadium. Kenya has never qualified for a World Cup final and are currently ranked 112 out of 206 nations by the Football World's governing body, FIFA. A research carried out in Sierra Leone has shown that some survivors of Ebola suffer from neurological and psychiatric conditions long after they recover from the initial disease. Researchers from the University of Liverpool and King's College London studied Ebola patients who had become infected in the outbreak that affected parts of West Africa 4 years ago. They found that many suffered from debilitating migraine-type headaches, strokes, major depression and anxiety disorders. Scientists say larger studies are needed, as well as more specialists to help treat people suffering from these long-term effects. More than 11,000 people died during the Ebola outbreak that hit West Africa between 2014 and 2016. The United Nations has asked South Sudan's government to prosecute perpetrators of killings and sex crimes in opposition villages this year. A new report by the UN Human Rights Office describes a campaign of horrific acts by state forces and aligned forces in which over 200 people were killed. The report also indicates that opposition forces had carried out armed attacks that caused civilian casualties.
The United Nations investigation has identified 3 South Sudanese commanders suspected of bearing the greatest responsibility in the violence in the Unity State between April the 16th and May the 24th that may amount to war crimes. In a report released, the UN Human Rights Office says at least 232 civilians were killed and 120 women and girls raped in scorched earth attacks by South Sudan government troops and aligned forces in opposition-held villages earlier this year.
This report documents violations, some of which could amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. A court of law would have to determine what these crimes are, but of course we have documented targeted killings of civilians, including the most vulnerable, and rapes and gang rapes, all of which would qualify as crimes under international law.
The UN report said opposition forces had also carried out armed attacks that caused civilian casualties.
In this report, the responsibility of the government forces is very high. The events took place in the context of attacks between the SPLA-IO, the opposition, and government forces. But a majority of the violations that were documented were the responsibility of the SPLA and proxy youth gangs that they have used against civilians in many of these villages.
A spokesperson for the South Sudanese army said it will respond once the military leadership had received the report.
The main recommendation is to hold the perpetrators to account. The government of South Sudan has in principle agreed to the establishment of a hybrid court for these crimes, and we hope that with the support of the African Union, who is charged with setting up this court, that prosecutions can start. But the government itself can prosecute these crimes and make sure that perpetrators do not continue to commit such crimes in impunity.
Since 2013, almost 2 million people have been internally displaced and another 2 million have sought refuge in neighboring countries. Earlier, South Sudan rebels rejected a peace plan to reinstate Machar as vice president under a deal reached at talks in Uganda a day before.
Here in Nigeria, the country's exact population figure has remained a subject of debate, with estimates put at between 180 and 200 million people. As part of the effort to finally resolve this, the House of Representatives is asking the federal government to make a pronouncement on the commencement date of the country's next census. The lawmakers also want the government to make provisions for funds in the 2019 budget and mobilize the National Population Commission for the completion of enumeration, area demarcation and preliminary preparation of the census. Our correspondent Terry Kumi reports.
The 11th of July every year is celebrated as World Population Day. It is a day set aside by the United Nations to raise awareness about population-related issues. The United Nations recommends that population census should be carried out every 10 years with an annual projected growth of 3%. However, in Nigeria, census has not been that regular. The last was 12 years ago in 2006, and before that, 1991.
Under which God has given liberty to man.
The House of Representatives is as worried as every Nigerian should be.
Consequently, census becomes a pivotal and necessary tool for the growth of any emerging society, which in turn informs decision-making at all facets and endeavors of both government and private sector. The House resolved to urge the federal government to make a pronouncement on the commencement date of the next census in the fourth quarter of 2019.
The lawmakers are particularly worried that the lack of accurate data on population in Nigeria has affected national planning and development at all levels.
On the issue of health care delivery, how do you know the number of hospitals you are supposed to build here and there? How do you know how to plan or to cater for your citizenry?
The word per capita, Mr. Speaker, is your GDP, that is the gross domestic product, based on your population, your national income divided by your population. Now, if you do not know the base, which is the population figure, how come you are able to talk about per capita income?
The House is urging the federal government to mobilize all citizens for the enumeration area demarcation and preliminary preparation for the census. In general, population figures are sources of data which are required by the government for effective forecasting and planning, and the lawmakers want the census conducted as early as next year. Terry Ikumi, Channels Television News.
The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, says months of clashes over land in southern Ethiopia have forced more than 800,000 people from their homes. The ICRC adds that there is a rapidly swelling humanitarian crisis in Gedio and West Guji areas, where the displaced are sleeping on the floors of crowded schools, office buildings and churches, and food and water are scarce. Last year, hundreds of thousands of people were displaced during clashes between ethnic Oromos and Somalis. And that's it on Network Africa. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Temitope Fagbemi.